I think it's telling that when Wilson went to Congress on April 2nd, 1917, people were not sure that he was going to ask for a declaration of war because he had hesitated for so long.
That said, we didn't declare war and say we were in an alliance with either side, but we would go in on the Allied side to try to end this war.
4 days after Wilson speaks to a joint session of Congress, the House and Senate approve his declaration of war. By this time, both armies in Europe are exhausted, but the promise of relief is still months away.
We've done very little to actually prepare ourselves for war. We have a regular army of about 190,000 men, some National Guard units that have been federalized because we were fighting on the border with Mexico in 1916. And if you think about it, it's kind of amazing in 18 months how American society basically completely transforms itself into a society that's capable of waging total war.
Theodore Roosevelt, now old and ill, favors a voluntary recruitment process. Wilson and his Secretary of War, Newton Baker, decide that only a national draft will supply the number of troops they need. Congress agrees.
The number of people who were drafted were 3.7 million, and the number of people who volunteered were probably in around the 700,000 range. But a lot of that is by design. People were only allowed to volunteer for the Army for a very short period in the beginning, and they did that on purpose because the way that selective service was sort of explained to the American people is that this is not a draft. This is not taking the unwilling out of their homes and putting them in the Army. This is selective service. This is selecting the people who are best going to serve the war effort by entering the military.
Now, one of the people who goes through the war years with a real sense of almost anguish, if you read his personal writings, is W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois sees the war as an opportunity, but he also recognizes that there's almost no other option. In a very famous editorial in The Crisis called Close Ranks, he urges African Americans to stand shoulder to shoulder and fight for democracy. And he believed, at least at this point, that by demonstrating the loyalty of African Americans, that there would be rights to come afterward.
The American Expeditionary Force, as it is called, is a microcosm of American society.
1 out of 5 is an immigrant. 13% are African Americans. The vast majority are working class, young men who come mostly into the Army from unskilled jobs. But there are a lot of men who volunteer, these college-educated men who tend to primarily become the officers in the military. I mean, it is American society at the time.
Mobilizing an industrial economy for the Great War requires an unprecedented degree of government involvement.
The Great War was the term the Europeans used for it. And for the Europeans, it was an overwhelming revolutionary experience. For the United States, clearly it didn't have that kind of an effect. But it did have a very significant, substantial effect. It increased the role of the government in the United States. The United States created something called the War Industries Board during the First World War, unheard of in earlier days, where the government would commandeer the productive capacity of the United States.
The war ramps up enthusiasm for federal involvement in overseeing manufacturing and trade insofar as that's possible during wartime, and to make sure the United States Army will have men and material available at not too inflated a wartime price. The problem with the War Industries Board is it doesn't have very much in the way of enforcement powers. It works by moral suasion, which doesn't always work with businessmen.
The existing labor pool cannot keep up with the industrial pace, especially as more and more workers are drafted. But then, factory owners hit upon a way to expand their workforce.
The war had an enormous effect on internal migration in the United States, especially migration of Southern blacks out of the South into the less restrictive, less segregated north of the United States.